Cool. All right. Welcome back, guys. We got another round table here. I'm David. We're joined with Leanne, Danny, and Shania, and we're going to be talking about low motivation with training, what slumps look and feel like, how to get out of them, and sort of, I guess, strategies that we implement as coaches to help our lifters and also ourselves to get out of these sort of slumps. Shania, do you want to kick us off with a little bit of I guess some personal stuff? What have you done with low motivation? Have you ever felt that? What have you done for yourself, for clients, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's more common than like people talk about. Like it's something that's not really, I guess, expressed, like it's it's always like intercomp and like competition days and how you go is always like spoken about. And then it's kind of just like I find personally it's like the post competition slump or like the post sort of slump of like a really good training block if it's not necessarily into like a competition. It's like, okay, you've either hit all these PRs or, you've walked away from like a really good competition and like performance. And then it's, I think naturally in the sport of powerlifting and people who are in the sport, it's like, okay, what's next? Like, where do I go now? Like, I want more. Like, you don't really like think about what you've just done or all of the training leading into it. It's kind of just like, okay, where do I go now? But it's just kind of like this like really empty feeling because you kind of just like continue to be in this like headspace of training and like attacking every training session for so long, and then it's kind of just like over. So that's what I find personally. But I think for me, getting through it, I don't find it too hard, but it could just be the environment I'm in and the people that I'm around that makes it obviously easier. Like that's a big thing. But personally, it's just the biggest thing is just acknowledging it. Like just for me, it's like, okay, just say that it's there. You're aware that it's there and just know that it's not going to be around forever. Like I will get through it. Keep just like tackling each training session with whatever sort of motivation you have on the day rather than it kind of constantly having to be at this high. Like if one day is high, one day is low, that's okay. Let it kind of ebb and flow. And then eventually you kind of just like reach this point where you almost just feel like you're back to normal or you're back to just like, okay, I'm enjoying training again. I'm having fun. I'm training with people that I want to train with. Like you'll slowly just kind of get back to that point. That's what I find personally works for me. As an athlete with my clients, I find that it's, I definitely give a lot more support to my clients. That's just like mine personally. And again, it's just like helping them to figure out what they need in the moment.
Yeah, okay. Leanne, do you find the same thing? Do you find either yourself or your clients mostly get those sort of low motivation as sort of periods after competitions? Have you had someone that has it like during a peak where they're just like, man, this comp, I just don't want to do it. Like motivation's so low. What do you find?
Yeah, I guess, like you said, it kind of depends where you're at. I feel like you can get it on either end. So I find that sometimes, like with clients, especially as they're close to competition and they're peaking, like fatigue is really high. And sometimes, I guess maybe it might be harder to find like the same arousal levels or excitement that maybe you had, a few weeks ago. Whereas like 2 weeks out, you're so fatigued that you're like, far out, I have to like hit this heavy single and I don't know if I can do it. So it's like the difference between that versus after comp. It's like after comp, like Shania said, it's like you've come off such a big high. It's like, what do I do now? So I think it's just about redirecting your training and your goals. So it's like you've done this comp. Now, what do we need to do to kind of transition out of this rather than just like continue? I mean, you can continue pushing after comp, but it's like, is that the right thing for you? And it kind of just depends on the client, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Have you ever dealt with it yourself personally?
I guess it's hard for me right now. I'm like, I have so much motivation going into World. So it's like, I can't, not necessarily, but maybe like after a big comp, it's like, I've definitely had those feelings of like, oh God, like it's like a low period, like especially that week after comp. Kind of depends how you've gone in the comp as well. Like if you had a really good comp, you might feel it, but then also if you haven't. So I guess, yeah, it just depends. But yeah, I've definitely had periods of it.
Yeah.
Danny, your thoughts?
I think there's a lot of like factors as to why low motivation might happen, right? So it's really important to identify why motivation might not be as high. So like Leanne and Shania touched upon, like when you're in a comp prep, there's always that sense of urgency and like needing to needing to perform every session. So despite having a low sense of motivation, like you have that in the back of your mind, like, all right, I still need to be able to do my job essentially, right? And so you'll still rock up to sessions, and there's that sense of discipline, right? Like it's cliche, but sometimes it's not about motivation, it's about discipline. And it's very easy with a sense of a timeline that's coming closer and closer. But I think if you're in a scenario where you're further away from competition, right? Or like say there is no competition in line and it's like more so external factors that are driving low motivation, it's important to identify those kinds of things and realize, like, is it a period of time where training can potentially be on the back burner, or is this something that someone needs to work through, right? Because if intent's not there and you're still forcing, like Leanne said, like high RPE type of exertion lifts, if you're not prepared, like it might even just be detrimental to your performance and recovery and things like that. So one, I think it's very important to identify why you're in that stage of motivation, like whether it's comp or external. And then two, like what's a way that you can maneuver outside of it. So touching upon, like, you know, can you dial training back, or does it need to be pushed? And it's very dependent on the situation that you're in.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think it's like,
go ahead.
yeah,
Shane.
I think I was just gonna say, like, I think it's important, like, that each client finds their own baseline, right? Because then, like, from that baseline of what they can do, where, like, as Danny just said, like, external variables and stresses are taken into account as well, that baseline can be, like, I guess, increase or decrease as needed to, correct? So I find that, like, from my experience, I guess it's like the people who have the really high highs and the really low lows is because it's kind of like, I guess, when they're not into a competition and we have like so much time to kind of just train, it's like they're not sure how to kind of manage that. So it's like, then as soon as they're in a comp prep, it's like they're 6 weeks out, for example, let's just say, and then it's just like 0 to 100. And then it's like, as soon as comp's done, it's like there's nothing. So it's like finding the baseline of like where someone can, you know, train at this, like, if we just use a percentage, like, you know, 70%, it's like that can be increased or decreased as needed to around like the competition schedule. Because for us, like, our schedule is the same. Like, we hit a state qualifier, you hit states, you hit nationals, you know, depending if that's your goals, like that's just kind of like year in, year out, right? So it's like being able to establish a baseline that can then be pushed from like an athlete and a coach perspective, and then come back down again when we don't need to be at that high all the time.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
I think at the same time, it's like, does it really need to be an issue if low motivation is there, right? Like, I think it's only an issue if it does affect not just the way you come into a session, but like sometimes if, say, even it affects sustainability of a session, if you're like skipping sessions because you're not feeling motivated, that's when it becomes a problem, because then you're missing key stimulus that's pushing you forward, right? So like the issue isn't about intent at that point. Like sometimes if, for example, like some people that just don't come into sessions because they feel tired and they're not motivated, that's where I think it's our job as coaches to remind lifters that, you know, like, although you're not motivated, like there's still something that you can do. Like we have autoregulation as a tool that you can use to still be able to come into the gym, and it doesn't have to be 100% every single session, like you said, Shania.
Yeah.
Well, you just
I
touched
think
on it
it's
a little bit, Danny, but do you guys have any tools you use from like a programming perspective? So we talked about, I guess, maybe discussing with the athlete that like they can't stay high all the time and they might need to bring themselves down and deal with these sort of low periods. But from like a programming perspective, is there any tools you guys can think of or may use to help your lifters sort of carry on through low motivation? Whether it's like, okay, maybe we train 4 days instead of 5, or what sort of tools or techniques do you use? Do you want to jump in, Leanne?
Yeah, I guess it depends where they are in like a training cycle, if they're in comp prep or if they're out of comp prep. So coming out of like a competition prep, you can kind of shift the focus to maybe like the higher rep sets or the accessories, adding in like some top sets on accessories and like setting goals rather than just, you know, the main SVD top sets. It's like actually shifting that focus to maybe the back offs and looking at those kind of things rather than, yeah, the stuff that you want to push more, I guess, in a comp prep in sense.
Okay. Shania,
Hmm.
Danny?
I agree
I'm
with
pretty
where
similar.
Leanne was going. Sorry, you can go,
No,
Shania.
no, you go, Danny. No, you're good.
Okay. I think periodizing training, like Leanne said, is a very good idea. Like, although we come from this idea of, you've got this set dosage of training that yields progress. I think sometimes the limiting factor isn't like physiological adaptation, but it's literally just burnout, right? And that sense of staleness that comes with it is just not being intentful with the training. And so therefore, like Leanne said, if you take the attention away from like trying to perform on heavy singles all the time, you can just go up to doubles or triples as a top set. That can detach yourself from constantly needing to see that like 1RM improve session to session. And especially if like you're coming from a context of it was comp prep with a peak and taper, and then you're like comparing it to post comp fatigue, everything with that, like it could be quite demotivating. So just detaching detaching the priority of each block, especially around that competition and post competition time, is I think really key. Outside of competition prep though, like say for example, external circumstances, work picks up, school, things like that. Auto regulation, I think, is a very big key, because the risk there is if you're not motivated and you're forced to like try and add load, the risk is just generally injury, under recovery, things like that. And so therefore you would rather set someone up to just get the stimulus in to essentially just maintain until they can like reach a point where they're able to recover and prioritize training again. So that's where I think auto regulation could be a key component with like low motivation.
Shania?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I definitely probably lean more into kind of similar to what Danny said, usually keep like or move away from the top singles. And then if I even have a top set, like sometimes I don't even do that. I'll usually just like keep that pretty like stagnant in the first kind of like few blocks as I'm communicating with the client, and get them to push more of like their back down work and stuff like that, like on squat and deadlift specifically. And then I usually pretty much like just let them go for accessories. Like I'll have like the non-negotiables that I want them to obviously have in there still, and then pretty much any other accessory that bases in there is like muscle building. It's like just max it out, like go for gold kind of thing. Because I feel like that just creates enjoyment. And then I just communicate as well. Like big one, like obviously auto regulating, but just finding an environment that they enjoy training in. So if they're like if like motivation is really low, like whether it's they have the ability to like go and train with friends or like change their gym environment, things like that, I kind of just encourage that as much as possible, because as anything, like I think you can be in the sport for as long as you want to, as long as you need to, but gym environment and people that you train with is like a huge factor to that as well.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree there. I think things that can also be useful is we all know that powerlifting and SBD training can be pretty like monotonous and very boring at times, just coming in and doing your low bar, your bench, and your deadlift on repeat year round. So I think there's a lot of power in variations, even though it may not be that different. It's something fresh and something that can get rid of the staleness of training if all you do is comp squat all the time. Maybe doing a tempo or a pause or a high bar is enough to sort of, be exciting and be something that you haven't done in a while. And that can also just be another route you can take, is just slightly changing I guess the variations you run, the specificity you're running, if things are getting to the point where training just is not enjoyable at all. So I think there's a lot of different things you can use to, I guess, bring motivation back. You can do the same thing with accessories. If you've been running the same thing for a while, like Shania said, have the non-negotiables in there and throw in some stuff you really like, and push through other avenues while you go through this sort of slump. So I guess the next thing would be like, what does training for the long term actually look like? Or like we hear about it all the time, right? Is like powerlifting's a long game. A lot of the world champions are sort of, either near or above 30. Like they've been in the game for years and years and years. What do you guys sort of think it takes to get there? Do you think it takes enjoying your training all the time? Is it something to do with, the coach client relationship? Is it all individual? Is it all on you? Like what are your takes on that?
I guess like it's first like figuring out how far you want to take it. So, whether you want to reach that world's level or not, and knowing that to get there, like you have to do the hard yards, and there's going to be times where you're not going to want to do it. And it's like being able to just get through that point, and like your training is not going to be great all the time, and knowing that through those slumps, it's like you just have to keep ticking the boxes and just getting through it, like Danny said before, like just auto regulate that period of time where you need to just keep going, because if you start skipping sessions and things, it's like you're going to start to get into that cycle where it's like you're not actually making progress, and then you keep your motivation or drive to train just keeps going down and down. So it's figuring out like how far you want to take it in the first place, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think goal setting is another huge thing. Like, people that do want to end up going to Worlds, that takes a very long time. And understanding that during that period of time, there's going to be like, you're going to have successes and you're also going to go through failures. And with that, I think there's also waves of like high motivation, low motivation, and understanding that like, as long as you don't stop at a point where it's like you're at a low point in motivation, because that's not the key. That's not the key thing, right? It's not about being motivated or demotivated. It's just ensuring that you're still training throughout all kinds of periods. One saying that I've seen is kind of like this 30% rule, right? So if you're going through some sort of like progressive training where it's like pretty high performance, 30% of it should be like pretty shit training, 30% should be pretty neutral, and then 30% is pretty great training, right? So it's constantly oscillating between like good sessions, bad sessions. But I think, yeah, to tie it all back, like it'll come down to, I think a key point is what the individual wants, because you can have a coach who will, set these goals for you, but if you're not bought into it and you're not feeling like that's what you want for yourself, there's always going to be a sense of struggle and motivation there, because it's not coming intrinsically.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just not catastrophizing the lows. Like, it's just like understanding that they're going to happen like just as frequent, sometimes maybe even more. Like, social media makes it worse, I feel like, because nobody really posts their failures on social media. No one posts like their losses. Like, no one really shows that on social media. So I think when you are in that like low motivation period, or like you're just not enjoying everything, and then you're on social media and it's like everyone's either posting all their PRs, or they're showcasing what they're doing and like the period that they're in, it can kind of just make it feel like, or just like catastrophize it even more. So it's just like understanding that I think any athlete at any level has to and will have gone through periods that are like up and down. It's just going to happen. So, and I think like Danny said, like as the athlete, like you have to, your coach can set whatever goal they want for you, but as I said, if you don't buy into it or you don't want it, like you're not going to go that far. Like you have to be the one to kind of set that goal yourself. And those goals do have to be, I think personally, like block to block, like year to year, like they have to be pretty consistent. Like you can't have one goal of like, I'm going to go to Worlds and then not have anything in between, because then it's just going to feel like you're never, ever, ever going to reach it. Like if you're not ticking off the small things, or you're not ticking off some goals that you're like proud of and like celebrating, then it's kind of just, you're going to feel like you're never going to reach that level, I guess. So that's something that I like instill in with my guys. And I definitely notice a difference between the athletes that do have kind of the goals that they tick off and then the ones that don't as consistent. You notice like sort of trends with that. So yeah.
Okay, I guess that all just kind of, it all ends up being the same thing, which is like having a why, right? And having a why that's strong enough to, I guess, sort of like push everything aside, and the why is stronger than all the excuses or all the reasons you have to not train at this point in time. So I think that's probably a big one, like you mentioned, is everyone has to have this intrinsic driver, this thing inside them that's, getting them up in the morning to go train, right? And I think, yeah, there's a lot of things that tie into that. And that thing can also change as you progress through your powerlifting journey, right? You might have second thoughts about, wanting to go to Worlds, or maybe that desire grows even stronger. So now you want to double down, you want to dial in your nutrition, you want to do all the 1%ers now. So I think there's like these big things that need to be, I guess, sort of assessed and evaluated every so often. Doesn't need to be all the time, but during these phases of like low motivation, it might be a good time to take a sort of step back, look at the bigger picture and think, okay, like, why am I doing this? Do I still want what I wanted, 6 months ago? And then if the answer is still yes, it's like, okay, well, you're probably just gonna have to grit your teeth and, put up with those 30% of bad sessions like Danny touched on. So I think it all sort of stems from there, which makes a whole lot of sense.
I think it just like separates the pack as well. Like if people like can go through a low motivation period, and it's like if their goal is to get to worlds and they're like assessing all of this and they're like intrinsically driven, that's what separates everybody else from everybody else, right? Like that's why there's like X amount of athletes or the top, world athletes right now compared to like everybody else. Like everyone's goal can be to go to worlds, but if you're not actually going to do the hard work and like be extremely honest with yourself and realistic, then it's probably not likely going to happen. Like what kind of separates people as well.
I think another important key point as well, like although we're discussing worlds, right? Like that idea of worlds or like a really far away goal is different for everyone. It doesn't have to be worlds, but if it's something that's significant to you personally, like I just want to hit a 2-plate bench or something like that, right? Like there's still going to be a struggle because progress isn't linear, even for the person that's just starting out powerlifting. So like it comes in scales. Like obviously the greater the goal, the more you'll fluctuate between these highs and lows. But I think it'll apply to everyone, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, the type of goal you set, you're still going to go through these periods. So it's important to know that like this applies for everyone, not just people that are like meant to be this high, like aiming for high achieving, right? If you're constantly just giving up during these low periods, it's probably a very good idea to like reevaluate what it is that you're trying to aim to do. Doesn't mean that everyone has to aim for worlds, but as long as that goal is something meaningful for you, that should be able to be a buffer enough for those low periods.
I guess communication is a big one as well at this point. Like I feel like a lot of the time people tend to drift away from, maybe their usual communication because they feel less motivated or things aren't working. But this is a point where it's like you should actually be communicating more so that you, with your coach in collaboration, it's like you can kind of readjust things if you need to, like readjust your goals. And it's okay to do that. Like it's okay to be like, go to your coach and be like, I don't feel like what I'm doing right now is aligned, or, you might have a different goal. Like you said, you don't have to go to worlds or it might change and that's okay. And it's just adapting along the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Like you were saying, like communication is key, right? So if you're still doing the same program and like it's getting more and more demotivating, like that's just going to be a negative spiral. So as soon as you nip it in the bud and bring it up, like if you do have that coach and athlete relationship, it's likely that you'll be able to make the necessary adjustment. And like David said, like that might be introducing some sort of variation. And if it is stemming from training itself, like that will help tremendously.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure. Any, I guess, sort of closing remarks on, I guess, motivation in general, and maybe even personal anecdotes of yourself, your other athletes, things you've done, or I guess like ways you can bridge. I know we talked about goal setting. Is there anything in particular you guys like to do with goal setting, whether it's block to block? Do your block to block goals lead to bigger goals? Are they all attached? Are they all separate? Do you do it with some athletes and not others? What are your sort of, I guess, takes on that?
I've got a little section where I just let people write their own goals. Some people will fill it out, some people might not, and that's where we might need a bit more like prompting as to like what do you want to achieve this block. But I find the people that involve themselves more into their own goal setting will generally be more driven to get to where they want to go.
I think in the initial, like when you first start with someone as well, it's like setting that from the start and figuring out, initially what are they looking to achieve and what does that look like, and then kind of adapting along the way. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that just like assessing, like, I guess, again, like what sort of level they're at, right? So like if it's like sort of like that novice lifter, it's like, okay, like Leanne said, like figuring out what they want to achieve first. Cause I feel like at the start of any sort of journey, it's like you are going to get a lot of sort of like those newbie gains. So it's like you kind of, it's exciting anyway, because you're almost just like learning something new PRing. So I find like with a lot of like the novice lifters, it's like getting them into a comp to enjoy the environment, experience it, and then sort of reassess from there. And then I find if it's like that sort of like they're transitioning from like a certain like novice intermediate or like intermediate to like higher sort of level in terms of powerlifting, that's when it's more about like the intrinsic goals. Cause it's like, okay, like we're sort of past that point of like the newbie gains and things like that. And it's like, all right, where do we actually want to go? Like, what do you want to get out of it? So I find that it's like a lot for like my clients, especially, it's either like block to block or like figuring out, okay, like how much experience do you want to get? Like, is this going to be like your first competition? Are you just getting into a sanctioned comp? Like, what are these expectations and goals? And then just like adjusting that as, I guess, each client gains experience. And then obviously as they gain experience, their goals will likely change. So it's just like addressing that and like having conversations like pretty frequently, whether it's like at the end of each block, to assess like how they're feeling, where they want to go. So yeah, that's what I usually do with a lot of my guys.
Okay, cool. I think that's pretty much all we'll touch on today. Does anyone have any closing thoughts, any statements they want to leave with, or everyone all good? Cool, everyone's good. Sweet. Cool. Thanks for listening, guys. Another episode of Roundtable coming out soon. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.